Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to reading John Locke's second treatise of government. Today we're doing chapter 6, which is on paternal power. Uh, Chapter 6 is rather long. It is, I think it is the fourth longest of the chapters. Chapter 6 has 25, so it's two sections shorter than last chapter, so I hope it won't be as long as last time. Um, um, and it is the fourth longest of the chapters. This deals with the concept of paternal power, which is again, remember, he's responding. Locke is responding to again Filmer's argument that political rule, that the king should be absolute rule of the king, and the king is like the father, and therefore that political power comes from paternal power. Locke is thus in this sense, a kind of anti-paternalist. Okay, he's a no. This is the attack on the patriarchy. John and all. This distinguishing between patriarchal or paternal power and political power. Okay, this stems back from the even beginning, where he makes that distinction between the rule of a magistrate and the rule of a father and a husband and a wife. Right, back in chapter 1. So let's look at section 52. It may perhaps be censored as an impertinent criticism in a discourse of this nature to find fault with words and names that have obtained in the world, and yet possibly it may not be amiss to offer new ones when the old are apt to lead men to mistakes. And this is of paternal power probably has done, which seems so to place the power of parents over their children wholly in the father, as if the mother had no share in it. Whereas, if we consult reason or revelation, we shall find she has an equal title. In other words, first of all, paternal, the title misleads us. Patriarchal, that was patriarch, father, paternal. In other words, this is why he instead of choosing the word patriarchal, he paternal power. Okay, so okay, this is because men and women have that reason and revelation argue that women play a very much role over the care and authority or care of children. Right. Um, this may give one reason to ask whether this might not be more properly called paternal power, right? For whatever obligation nature and the right of generations lay on children, it must certainly brand them equally on both the concurrent causes of it. In other words, both there's obligation. If children have obligations, they're up to those who create them. It's not only to the father but also to their mothers. Okay? This is that cause it, and the concurrent causes of it, right? And accordingly, we see the positive law of God everywhere joined together without distinction when it commands the obedience of children. Honor thy father and thy mother, Exodus 20, verse 12. Whosoever curses his father or his mother, Leviticus 29. Ye shall fear every man his mother and his father, Leviticus 19:3. Children, obey your parents, and etc. Ephesians 6, verse 1, is the style of the Old and New Testament. 53. Had but this one thing been well considered, without looking any deeper into the matter, it might perhaps have kept men from running into these gross mistakes they have made about this power of parents, which, however, it might, without any great harshness, bear the name of absolute dominion and regal authority, when under the title of paternal power it seemed appropriated to the father. Yet it would found yet it would founded but oddly, and in the very name shown at the absurdity of this supposed absolute power over children, has been called paternal, and thereby have discovered that it belonged to the mother too. For it will be very ill served the turn of those men who counted so much for the absolute power and authority of the fatherhood, as they called it, that the mother should have any share in it, and it would have but ill supported the monarchy they contend for, when by the very name it appeared that the fundamental authority from whence they would derive their government of a single person has not been placed in one, but two persons jointly. But let this of names pass. In other words, this is a very interesting thing what he argues here, and then he says, "Oh, let's not pay attention to the question of names, patriarchal power, paternal power, But he will still go by this, and argues that this, like, he makes a big thing about, well, it's two parents, not one, and patriarchy. Now, what Locke is failing to address, and I think this is the problem here. Where does this idea of parental power over children, particularly the father's power over children, come from? Now, Locke is very much being a kind of deceptive here. He points to the Bible, right? He points to reason. But he forgets that the origins of a lot of this things come from Roman culture, okay? That, in other words, we have to remember the patria, the father, is the Latin word, and the Latin power of the fathers was imperium. That is a power of life and death. And that in Roman culture, the father had the power of life and death over his children, but not over his wife. Okay, and this is very much completely different from what was done in Greece. Okay, the Greeks had the opposite situation where you kept your wife locked up, but you dared not touch your own blood. Okay, where in the Latin model, the Roman model, or the Latin, or this Tuscan / Roman model, or the Latin model, you had this view that the father had the power of life and death over their children, to the point of all their lives, always. And even as an adult, the father could decide whether their child lived or died. In fact, daughters were always under the authority of their father, even when they gave marriage. That therefore, this is why a husband could not punish the wife for adultery. The husband had to convince her father or her family that she was guilty of it. And then only then, because if he divorced her without doing that, he'd have to return the dowry, okay? Any kind of financial arrangement, the marriage was created. And that and that thus, in the Roman sense, women were never really part of the family. The children were. Even though the mother is the father of that, the fact that the father has total possession. So Filmer's critique of an argument of patriarchal, and actually remember, this is why the Roman Rex is so terrifying versus why the Greek Basileus is not, because the Greek conception of the father over his children was limited. He could not touch the blood of his own kind. He could not touch the blood of his own kind. This is seen in Aeschylus's great tragedy, the great trilogy, the tragedy of Oistria, right? About Aeschylus and about King M again and return, his wife killing him, and his son through there, both of those, the son of the murderer, so also Orestes, kills mother because God, the Apollo, and Zeus has ordered him to take vengeance on the father. But then what happens is the Furies, the forces of vengeance, go after him. So the Greeks have this conception of the Fury, that blood once blood is spilled, the passions of the blood and the family ties will drive others of that family tie to take vengeance, right? So therefore, this is a taboo, that touching one's own blood is a taboo that the Romans clearly do not share, because the father has the absolute power to kill the child. And this is the fear that, and therefore this is why in other words, the Greeks will very much treat women like the idea of locking them in the household. Only the Spartans allow women great freedom. The only people, the Greek Romans, the Spartans would allow women to have public roles and out there and be allowed there. The only women in the public sphere in most Greek cities were either prostitutes or slaves. No free woman would ever leave the household. Okay, would ever go into the market or the public sphere. Okay, the only prostitutes and slaves were the only women in the market or the public spaces. That's why many of the public men at public events are not, in Greek political writing, are not accompanied by wives, but rather high class prostitutes. Okay, um, this is the very interesting aspect of the difference between Greco culture versus Roman culture, and how Roman culture shapes the Roman Empire, shapes the culture of Europe, and shapes the concept of fatherhood, and it also shapes the power of monarchy. Okay, so therefore Locke here is not addressing this. Locke doesn't address this. Rather, he just uses the Bible as kind of a mechanism to challenge the assumption, and not really understanding what he wants to simply just avoid the question, and therefore he wants to redefine. Okay? He's changed the meaning. Instead of talking about patriarchal power, he's going to speak about paternal power. And this introduction here frames the mechanism by how he does this. Okay. So let's go look it up here, right there. Though I've said in chapter 2 that all men are by nature equal, I cannot be supposed to understand all sort of equality. Age or virtue may give men a just presidency. Excellency of part and merit may place others above the common level. Birth may subject some, an alliance or benefits others, and to pay an observance to those whom nature, gratitude, or other respects may have made to do. And yet all this is consistent with equality, which all men are in with respect of jurisdiction or dominion over another. So in other words, this idea here is that his understanding of equality is not the condition. It's about status. In other words, the status of being under jurisdiction of, or under the authority of. That his argument of all men are equal, it really means that no man is a natural ruler over any other man. Okay, no man has the ultimate authority to command or control or have absolute power over any other man. That is the only thrust of what equality means in Locke here. Um, now let's go back to the semicolon here, which was the equality I there spoke of as the proper to the business in hand, being as proper to the business at hand, being that equal right that each man hath to his natural freedom, without being subject to the will or authority of any other man. So that's what natural equality means. That no one is subject to the authority of another man. Okay, that unless through their consent or agreement. And even then, one can never agree. Go back again. Can never agree that one is under absolute power. You never can. You can never give to another person the. You can grant limited authority, but you cannot submit yourself to be under the absolute power of another. Okay, because that is to be in that state is to be in a condition of war, because that would mean that you could not guarantee your safety would be at the whim of that person. and therefore that's the whole point. That's the condition of war, right? And that's slavery. Okay, this is why it's despotic in that sense. Now at 55, children, I confess, are not born in this full state of equality, though they are born to it. In other words, they're not born in it. In other words, they're not born equal, but they're born to be equal in that sense, right? To it. Their parents have a sort of rule and jurisdiction over them when they come into the world, and for some time after. But it is but a temporary one. Now this is not. Now he is right here completely countering the argument of the Roman argument, the Roman view of father paternal power, which is permanent. The power of the father is eternal in the Roman view. Now, he is not arguing that no, the power of the parent is limited. It's not. It doesn't always last. It's a temporary one. He says the bonds of this subjection are like the swaddling clothes they are wrapped in. A metaphor, using a nice good analogy here. As the child is in the swaddling clothes, but they're not always going to be in saddling clothes. They will grow out of it, and they will grow out of the need for the care or control by their parents, right? And are supported by in the weakness of their infancy. Age and reason, as they grow up, loosen them, till at length they drop quite off, and leave a man at his own free disposal. Okay. In other words, the idea that once you become an adult, once you have full reason, you don't have to subject yourself to the authority of parents anymore. 56. Adam was created a perfect man, his body and mind in full possession of their strength and reason, and was so capable from the first instant of his being to provide for his own support and preservation, and governing his action according to the dictates of the laws of reason which God has implanted in him. From him, the world is peopled with his descendants, who are all born infants, weak and helpless, without knowledge or understanding, but to subject, but to supply the defects of this imperfect state, till the improvement of growth and age has removed them. Adam and Eve, and after them all parents, were by the law of nature under an obligation to preserve, nourish, and educate their children they had begotten, not as their own workmanship, but the workmanship of their own Maker, the Almighty, to whom they were to be accountable for them. So this idea here is that, okay, wait a minute, that one is not his. Now what he's doing here is he's relying on the authority of Scripture. That that in other words, and the authority of the biblical account of creation, that God created man and created man perfectly, right? But then what happened? Well, other people were born from Adam and Eve. They weren't born as Adam and Eve were perfectly grown and perfectly possessing of reason. They're born needy and not fully possessing reason. But they will grow up to be capable of independence and capable of reasoning, ideally, or if things don't go amiss, right? Mostly they should, right? As they grow of age and maturity, they should grow in ability, the ability to survive on their own, and their ability to have reason to understand things, right? But the point here is also saying is that therefore, because of this, there is kind of a care requirement, this shepherd thing, like God. These children are helpless and needy, and God kind of says, "Well, these are under your care. They're not your creation. Yes, they are your creation, but they're not simply your work product. In other words, God is the real instrument of them coming to be. The argument is uh, 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 not you in that sense. You're not the true master. The Creator is the true master. The argument is you're merely responsible for them until they're capable, right? And that you have an obligation to preserve, nourish, and educate. In other words, them. And this is not as your workmanship, but it's kind of caretaker for what God has provided. Okay. So and the parents will be accountable to God for their proper doing of this. So they don't take care of that, then there is a count that they have failed to do what as God has provided them with these conditions, they would be responsible to helping the children to do this. And if you have not done that, then you're accountable in this logic of what Locke has said here, right? So therefore, Locke is relying on very much biblical authority here to make to sell this argument, right? In other words, his argument. But let's look at the argument of what does he yet explain this from on a pure rational point of view of his logic of his model? No, not really yet, not yet. The law. 57. The law that was to govern Adam was the same that was to govern all his posterity, the law of reason. But his offspring have another way. But his offspring having another way of entrance into the world, different from his, by natural birth, that produced them ignorant and without the use of reason. They were not presently under that law, for nobody can be under a law which is not promulgated to him, and this was being promulgated or made known by reason only. He that is not come to the use of his reason cannot be said to be under this law. And Adam's children, being not presently as soon as born under this law of reason, were not presently free. Not for law, it is its true notion is not so much the limitation as the direction of a free and intelligent agent to his proper interest, and prescribes no farther than is for the greatest good of those who are under that law. Could they be happier without it? The law, as a useless thing, would itself vanish, and that ill deserves the name of confinement, which hedges us in only from bogs and precipices. So, in other words, now he's making that line. He's saying here is what that the law about men should be free and equal depends upon the ability to have reasoning to understand this. That children aren't fully developed to defend, take care of themselves or to have full reasoning. They cannot be subject to that same principle. Rather, what happens is, therefore, it wouldn't be useful in that sense. In other words, he says that direction of free intelligent proper interest and prescribe no farther than the general good of those under the law. Right. So, could they be happier without it? The law was as a useless thing. Would it? In other words, because he's saying that it doesn't apply to them. It doesn't. Therefore, it's useless. But it does apply to them in time when they have reason. Therefore, they are in the same condition as Adam was at the beginning. In other words, it's until they have the same capacities as Adam, they're not under the law. But the second they have the same capacities and abilities of Adam, then they are under that law. Okay, so this law is not just merely a kind of something that hedges us from bogs or precipices. So that, however, it may be mistaken that the end of law is not to abolish or restrain, but to preserve and enlarge freedom. So therefore, law is not about removing freedom, that there's prescriptions in these things that happen, but rather to enlarge it. Okay, this is interesting in that sense. For in all states of created beings capable of laws, where there is no law, there is no freedom. Whoa. For liberty is to be free from restraints and violence from others. Whoa. Which cannot be where there is no law. Whoa, whoa, whoa. I mean, doesn't this blow away the whole argument of the state of nature then, whether no one is under nature? Wait a minute. What he's saying here seems to fundamentally contradict the idea that there is the state in the state of nature. There is this, there it, you know it, that the state of nature is not as violent and just in other words, Hobbes's account is simply wrong, right? Now this seems to suggest that wait a minute, without law, there is no freedom. So whoa, no, but wait a minute, there's no law in the state of nature. Well, yes, there is. There's the law of nature, but the law of nature has no. It's not law in a normal sense. It's just. It is just guidelines that of occurrence, like the physical laws of nature. There's no. There's only self-enforcement, automatic enforcement. There's no real enforcement of violations. Okay, there's no judge. There's no executive. Okay, the only executive, every actor themselves in the state of nature is the executive and judge, right? So okay, so now when he makes this statement here, right? Um, where there's no law, but freedom is not, as we are told, a liberty for every man to do what he lists. For who could be free when every man's humor might domineer over him? But a liberty to dispose, and orders as he lists his person, action, possessions, and his whole property within the allowance of those laws under which he is, and therein not to be subject to an arbitrary will of another, but freely following his own. Whoa! So in other words, this law of nature has to be kind of a rule, which limits, in other words, which fundamentally prohibits and limits men, and empowers them to be free, limits those to have authorizing power. Or if it doesn't, then we have to create one. In other words, and that only with government does this become true. Hobbes is clearer here. Locke is murky, and he's purposely, intentionally murky, I believe, because he wants to clothe himself in the Christian Aristotelianism as much as possible, and not make the more blatant Hobbesian argument that no, in nature there is no freedom in this sense, or rather freedom in because freedom means there's a freedom means that you're able to enjoy things, to be free from restraint and violence of others, right? And that if freedom in this sense, we're told, but freedom is not, as we are told, a liberty for each. In other words, but freedom is not, as we are told, a liberty for each man to do what he lists. For who could be free? In other words, this is a critique of Hobbes. In other words, again, liberty is not, the natural freedom cannot be. If natural freedom is to do what we want, as Hobbes says it is, then that's not freedom. Okay, this is a very interesting thing here. And this whole, in other words, because this idea that their actions, person, property, within the allowance of those laws under which he is, therein not be subject to the arbitrary will of another, but freely follow his own. Right? 58. The power then that the parents have over their children arise from that duty which is incumbent on them to take care of their offspring during the imperfect state of childhood, to inform the mind and govern the actions of their yet ignorant non-age, yet of their yet ignorant non-age, till reason shall take its place, and ease them of that trouble is what the children want, and the parent are bound to. For God has given man to an understanding to direct his action, has allowed him freedom of will and liberty of acting, of properly belonging thereunto, within the bounds of that law which he is of that law he is under, which every person is under. In that sense, that every actor is under. In other words, he has the free has an understanding of action, has freedom. They have the freedom of will, freedom of active, and the proper and as properly belonging within the bounds of law, the law of reason, the law of of, of free acting, right? But while he is while he is in the an estate wherein he has not understanding of his own to direct his will, he is not to have any will of his own to follow. That he understands for him, which must for him, comma, must will for him too. In other words, for he must prescribe to his will and regulate his action. But when he comes to the estate that made his father a free man, the son is a free man too. So therefore, the idea here is that the child has no will of his own. But wait a minute, anyone who knows with children knows from the get-go instant that children have will. They assert their will. In other words, that every creature has a will in this sense, or a sense of desire, actions. But the argument is they lack reason to know what is truly their will, and not wrongly know. Right? This is that I. So until they have reason, they're not really capable of having a will or exercising their will properly, and therefore until that time they're under the control and authority of parents. Right? This seems to be the logic of what Locke's saying here. But once they have that reason and capacity, they come into the same state that his father, a freeman, right, a free person. Therefore, they become a free person too. So it's not that in other words, the argument is yes, that children are born into under authority, but that authority is not permanent. It's only because of their condition, and once their condition becomes equal to that of Adam, that of capable of reasoning and able to actualize things, that they're fully mature and they fully possess their reason, they have the same rights as Adam did in this natural order, right? 59. This holds in all the laws a man. This holds in all the laws a man is under, whether natural or civil. Is a man under the law of nature? What made him free of that law? What gave him a free dispositioning of his property according to his own will within the compass of that law? I answer, a state of maturity, wherein he might suppose capable to know that law, so that he might keep his actions within the bounds of it. So therefore, in other words, maturity means here the ability to know the rules of the laws that you're in, whatever set of laws you're in. And if you don't have that ability to know and to know what the laws are, and to behave according to them in that sense, you're under the guidance. You don't if you don't have the maturity in that sense. Locke seems to be saying here. Even now, this is true either in both civil, natural law, and civil law reasoning too. It says right. In other words, therefore, he says, I say to maturity, wherein he might suppose capable to know that law, so that he may keep his actions within the bounds of it. When he has acquired that state, he is presumed to know how far that law is to be his guide, and how far he may make use of his freedom, and so comes to have it. Till then, somebody else must guide him, who is presumed to know how far the law allows a liberty. For such a state of reason, such as an age of discretion, made him free. The same shall make his son free too. Is a man under the law of England? What made him free of that law? that is, to have the liberty to dispose his actions and possess according to his own will, within the permission of that law. A capacity of knowing that law, which is supposed by that law at the age of 1 and 20 years, so 21, right? And in some case sooner. Therefore, civil, in other words, every law in every society will have an age of that. All of a sudden, that you become you have understanding and capability to be held under the law. That's right. This idea of maturatus. Children can be also something, but usually we argue that with children are usually put under separate laws and separate constitutions, right? Once you're in a treaty, you're treated as every other citizen, as an adult, right? Um, and this is like a lot of things. This is like statutory, the idea of statutory rape and things like that, which are about the fact that if you're under age of consent, you cannot consent to something. You can't even engage in contracts. Some people argue that children cannot engage in any contracts legally because they don't have the maturity or age to do it, and therefore, until they have the maturity of age or of the age of consent, therefore they cannot engage in business relationship. They can't engage in contracts. They need their parents' permission. They need to be the authority over them to be able to do it. Now, we don't like this today. Modern child rights and ideas like this goes radical. But then, if that's the case, if there's no subject and every individual authority to this, don't we get the Hobbesian problem? Locke tries to solve this. Locke's answer here is trying to avoid the situation that everyone is, in other words, there is the freedom to do whatever one's want, and therefore this leads to the war of all against all. He's trying to explain, well, wait a minute, and he wants to argue against paternal authority being the ultimate authority, but at the same time he wishes not to be accused of making the Hobbesian position, right? This Locke is within this rhetorical frame of trying to avoid, he disagrees completely with Fulmer and this old traditional idea of Roman idea of paternal power. But at the same time, he and therefore will use the, the philosophic tradition and Christianity as an ally in the cause. But at the same time, he really seems to be advancing a very Hobbesian conception, but one that embraces more of the appearance of the Christian and Aristotelian framework. And this whole discussion of parental power seems to be a middle ground between what is Roman and versus what is the biblical, right? This is that, and also the Greek in that sense, right? Um, a capacity, in other words, if this made the Father free, it shall make the Son free too. Then, till then, we see the law allows the Son to have no will, but he is to be guided by the will of the Father or guardian, who is to understand for him. And if the Father die and fails to substitute a deputy in his trust, if he hath not provided a tutor to govern his Son during his minority, during his want of understanding, the law takes care to do it, or some other must govern him and be a will to him until he hath attained to the age of freedom and his understanding to be fit to take government of his will. But after that, the Father and the Son are equally free, as much as a tutor and pupil after nonage, equally subject to the same laws together, without any dominion left in the Father over his life, liberty, or estate of his Son, whether they be only in the state and under the law of nature, or under the positive law of an established government. So, in other words, in many ways, Locke here is really resting on the English common law in that sense, the English common law traditions of the person and parental concerns, which arises not. I mean, it is kind of a rejection of Roman, the Roman principle. Okay, The Roman principle is paternal rule, paternal father. Um, um, the paternal power thing is also tied to family control and aristocratic culture too. So there is something egalitarian here, nevertheless. In other words, democratic, something more democratic in the English law, or at least um, permitting. In other words, this is the common law seems to have an egalitarianism that is not present in the custom practice of Roman institutions or aristocratic cultures in that sense. So this is again this is interesting in that sense, right? Section 60. But if through the defect that may happen out of an ordinary course of nature, any one comes not so much a degree of reason, wherein he might be supposed capable of knowing the law, and so living within the rules of it, he is never capable of being a free man. He is never let loose to the disposition of his own will, because he knows no bounds to it, has not understanding its proper guide, but is continued under the tuition and government of others. All the time, his own understanding is incapable of that charge. And so, lunatics and idiots are never set free from the government of their parents. Right? This is the problem. What happens to people who never are able to develop the mental age? It was no that as they grow, they may grow, but they never achieve the capable of the ability of reasoning to be able to take care to know what the laws and rules of things are. They don't. They're rash. In other words, their rationality is defective. What about the people whose minds lack the ability to have possess right reason? And the argument here is that they're under the authority of parents forever. In other words, until they achieve the ability to participate in the exercise of right reason, or a capacity to use reason to know what is their judgment and how to engage in judgment, they don't have they have no will of their own. Okay, right, and hence lunatics and idiots are never free from the government of their parents. And instead of lunatics and idiots, we'll say the mentally ill, right? The mentally ill, the disabled, those who have mental defects or incapacities. Now, some have argued this is the natural slave in Aristotle, and I think that isn't. There's a possibility for that view, and therefore there is this apparent agreement between Locke here and Aristotle regarding what about those who will not have the capacity to be self-governing, a free person. They are not capable. Their reason, they lack reason. They don't have the capacity for reasoning. They don't have the capacity. Every man should have the capacity. Every man as a man and who has is subject to the law of nature, which says that no one should be under absolute authority of someone else, is one who possesses reason. But what about those who don't possess reason? Animals don't possess. Animals don't have the rational of man. And that's why they're the human being. They're under the authority of human beings, right? As long as they don't waste them or spoil them, right? That's the whole property argument, right? Um, so too here is this limits of children. That the children are like, if a child or a person is like an animal, does not have the capacity of and the faculty of right reason that gives him the ability to have proper judgments, then they are to be treated as under their authority. Now, of course, the authority again, like the question of animals, to their benefit. In other words, you can't just destroy them, you can't just wipe them out, you can't let them spoil. As you could not let the animals under your care just simply spoil. You have to take care of them. You can consume the animals, right? But you have to not let them waste, right? Hence, in other words, you have to keep. This is that interesting point that I'm not sure. I mean, that's the logic of what would be from what's there, right? Um, Children who are not yet come into years whereat they may have an innocence which are excluded by a natural defect from ever having. Thirdly, madmen, which for the present cannot possibly have the use of right reason to guide themselves, have for their guide the reason that guideth other men, which are tutors over them, and seek to procure their good for them. Even Hooker, Ecclesiastical Polity, Book 1, Chapter 7, all of which seems no more than their duty, which God and nature laid on man, says well of, as other creatures, to preserve their offspring till they can be able to shift for themselves, and will scarce amount to an instant of proof of parental legal authority. In other words, will scarce amount of an instant or proof of parental legal authority. In other words, there's not. In other words, if parents had legal authority of this forever and ever and ever, um, uh, 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 but the fact that parents have the once you have a situation where you have to have care for them, and that once they reach the ability to help, your authority over them ends. Okay, therefore it's not a permanent authority, but parental authority is not permanent. It is temporary until the ability of the child or the actor is capable of engaging in the same reason as the adult. And then once they have that, they're no longer under the parental authority, right? And if they and likewise, if you don't, your parents die, and if they have not prepared for care for you, the society or the other thing but gives care for you, right? And I think this is the difference. I think at this point, Locke is this account of parental authority is one that is not. The question is this in nature or is this in society? Locke is not clear on this. I think every case he gives in here seems to be more pointing to that this is within frameworks of given society, and that these relationships or these rules are very much shaped by civil law, civil institutions. But then he insists that this is true also in the state of nature. But one wonders in that sense. Let's now look at the next thing. 61. Thus, we are born free, as we are born rational. But we're not born rational. We're born with the capability of becoming rational at a certain time. But we're not born with the capacity to reason immediately, right? So therefore, this is a very interesting thing. Thus, we are born free, as we are born rational. Not that we actually, not that we actually, not that we have actually the exercise of either. Age that brings one brings it to the other two. So in other words, that we are born free, and we are born rational, and we have only once we have reason, then we have freedom. Freedom, in other words, we have that, but then we're born, we don't have the possession of reason, and because we don't have the possession of reason, we don't have the possession of freedom. The realm of freedom is the realm of reason, of freedom. Reason and freedom are connected. If you lack reason, you lack freedom, the ability to be free. Okay, this is a very interesting point. Very classical in that sense as well. This is the appearance. And thus we see how natural freedom and subjugation to parents may consist together and are both founded on the same principle. A child is free by his father's title, by his father's understanding, which is to govern him till he has it of his own. The freedom of a man at years of discretion and subject of the child to his parents. Yes, whilst yet short of that age, are so consistent and so distinguishable that the most blind contender for monarchy by right of fatherhood cannot miss this difference. The most obstinate cannot but allow their consistency. For were their doctrine all true, were the right heirs of Adam now known, and by that title settled a monarch in his throne, invested with all the absolute unlimited power Sir Filmer talks of. He should die as soon as his heir. If he died as soon as his heir was born, must not the child, notwithstanding, be he were never so free, never so much sovereign, to be in subjection to his mother and nurse, to tutors and governors, till age and education brought him reason and the ability to govern himself and others? No, this is again. He said, well, what happens here is we discover who's Adam's rightful heir is, and he's automatically given the power of absolute rule. Then what happens? He has a child and dies. Well, now the child is the rightful king, but the child is a child under the care of the mother and nurse. Is the child king? Is he able to rule like the father? Locke is kind of punning this, is making the. This is a classic kind of absurd, right? He's doing this and he's mocking Filmer's argument, trying to blow holes in the Filmer's argument. The necessity of his life, the health of his body, the information of his mind require him to be directed by the will of others, not his own. And yet, will anyone think that this restraint and subjugations were inconsistent with or spoiled him of that liberty or sovereignty that he had a right to, or gave away his empire to those who had the government of his nonage? This government over him only prepared him the better and sooner for it. If anybody should ask me, when my son is of age to be free, I shall answer when his monarch is the age to govern. But at what time, says the judicial hooker, Ecclesiastic Polity 1, chapter 1, section 6. A man may be said to have obtained so far forth the use of reason is suffice to make him capable of those laws whereby he is bound to guide his actions. This is a great deal more easy for sense to discern than for anyone by skill and learning to determine. In other words, that this is an argument easy. This is a great deal more easy far more easy for sense to discern. This is our sensing. In other words, is he mature enough to handle it? Okay, our senses can see whether this person is capable of making these decisions or not. Whereas skill and learning may not. In other words, some people may have the ability and others may not. So there's no skill and learning doesn't give us a clear guide who is capable of having reasoning and who's not, what age, what time. 62. The commonwealths themselves take notice and allow that there is a time when men are to begin to act like freemen. Therefore, till that age requires not oaths of fealty or alliance or other public owning of or submission to the government of their countries. So the idea that even commonwealths and other political things understand that maybe there's until they're of age, children and people who don't have the capacity to make free judgments are not necessarily obliged to obey or submit or to like this. But that's okay. Section 63. The freedom then of man and liberty of acting according to his will is grounded on having reason, which is able to instruct him in that law he is to govern himself by, and make him know how far he is left to the freedom of his own will. To turn him loose to his unrestrained liberty, before he has the reason to guide him, is not the allowing him the privilege of his nature to be free, but to thrust him out among brutes and abandon him to a state of wretchedness, and as much beneath that of man as theirs. This is that which puts the authority into the parents' hand to govern the minority of their children. God has made it their business to employ this care on their offspring, and he hath placed them in them suitable inclinations of tenderness and concern to temper this power, to apply it as his wisdom designed it, to the child's good, as long as they should be under it. 64. But what reason can hence advance this care of the parents due to their parental offspring into an arbitrary, absolute arbitrary dominion of the father, whose power reaches no father, than by such a discipline as he finds most effectual, to give such strength and health to their bodies, with such vigor and rectitude to their minds, as may best fit his children, to be most useful to themselves and others. And if it be necessary to his condition to make them work, then they are able for their own substance. But in this power, the mother too has her share with the father. So, in other words, this is him continuing this idea of what does paternal care mean, but not only the father has this authority over the children and the guidance of what to do, but also the mother. Okay, 65. Nay, this power so little belongs to the father by any particular right of nature, but only that he is guardian of his children, that when he quits his care of them, he loses his power over them, which goes along with their nourishment and education, to which it is inseparably annexed. And it belongs as much to the foster father of an exposed child as to the natural father of another. So therefore, in other words, the issue here is the care and nourishment of the child, be it of the natural father or the foster father. Okay, in other words, it's about the authority of this is that the child is not capable of doing this, and that the authority of the father is that I'm giving you care and I'm giving you nourishment, and you don't have the ability to do it yourself, and to therefore this is what this means to, right? So little power does the bare act of begetting give a man over his issue, if all his care ends there, and this be all the title he hath to the name and authority of a father. In other words, this is almost like saying what matters is, in other words, here Locke seems to argue genetic inheritance, that the actual genetic, the fact that you're the biological father of this has no real import here, or very little import here, than the fact that your care and your sustenance. In other words, this is a social. In other words, this is a societal right or authority, not a genetic or biological right. Okay, um, or a condition or something. Um, so little power does the bare act of begetting give a man over this issue. In other words, that's it. And what will become of this parental power in part of in that part of the world where one woman hath more than one husband at a time, or in those parts of America where when the husband and wife part, which happens frequently, the children are all left to the mother, follow her, and are wholly under her care or provision. If the father dies while the children are young, do they not naturally everywhere owe their same obedience to their mother during their minority as to their father if he were alive? And will anyone say that the mother has a legislative power over anyone's? And will anyone say that the mother hath a legislative power over her children? That she can make standing rules, which shall be a perpetual obligation, by which they ought to regulate all the concerns of their property and bound their liberty all the course of their lives? Or can she enforce the observation of them with capital punishment? Again, this is a direct critique of Roman practice, right? For this is the proper power of the magistrate. In other words, this power of capital punishment, these things. For this is the proper power of the magistrate, for which the father hath not so much as the shadow of this authority. Okay, his command over his children is but temporary, and reaches not their life or their property. Oh, fathers have no control of their life or their property. Okay, but it is but a help to the weakness and imperfection of their knowledge, a discipline necessary for their education. And although a father may dispose of his own possessions as he pleases, when his children are out of danger of perishing for want, yet his power extends not to the lives or goods, either which either of their own industry or another's bounty has made theirs, for nor to their liberty, neither when they are at once arrived to an enfranchisement of the years of discretion. The father's empires then cease. In other words, once they get, in other words, they have they don't even have control over their lives. They can't touch their lives. They can't kill their children. They can't do this. They have no ability to touch their lives or their property or their industry in that sense. And once they get their age, they have the right to control. They don't have the right to control it after their age, right? When the father empire cease, and he can from thenceforward no more dispose of the liberty of his son than that of any other man. And it must be far from absolute or perpetual jurisdiction, from which a man may withdraw himself, having license from divine authority to leave his father and mother and to cleave to his wife. That's that line that you leave your father and have that's a biblical passage, right? Section 66. But though there be a time when a child comes to be free from subjection to the will and command of his father, as the father himself is free from the subjection to the will of anybody else, and they are each other under no restraint, but that which is common to them both, whether it be the law of nature or municipal law of that country. Yet this freedom exempts not a son from that honor which he ought, by the law of God and nature, to pay his parents. God having made the parents instruments in his great design of continuing the race of mankind and the occasion of life to their children, as he hath laid on them an obligation to nourish, preserve, and bring up their offspring, so he has laid on the children a perpetual obligation of honoring their parents, which containing in all which containing in it an inward esteem and reverence to be shown by all outward expression, ties up the child from having anything that may ever injure or affront, disturb, or endanger the happiness or life of those from whom he received his. It engages him in all actions of defense, relief, assistance, and comfort of those by whom means he entered into being and has been made capable of any enjoyments of life. From this obligation, no state, no freedom can absolve children. Therefore, there is this. He makes a very interesting argument here that there is this sense of obligation that your parents gave you birth, they've taken care of you. Now you're free, as an adult, you're free and capable, and you're in this state because your parents did this, and that you have kind of an obligation to do what he says here. Remember, to defense, relief, assistance, and comfort, right? For those who made capable any enjoyment of life. And this obligation, no state, no freedom can dissolve it. But this is very far from giving parents a power of command over their children. So, yes, they have obligation, but being under obligation does not mean you're under command, right? This command and obligation are two different things here, Locke seems suggesting, over their children, or in authority to make laws and dispose as they please the lives or liberties or property of it is one thing to owe honor, respect, gratitude, and assistance, another to require absolute obedience and submission. The honor due to parents, a monarch in his throne owes to his mother, and yet this lessens not his authority, nor subjects him to her government. In other words, this is the idea. Well, wait a minute. What, he then throws the argument that a mother. In other words, he's using parental arguments to he basically mock the kind of arguments Filmer makes from parental power, the powers of kings. Right, the king has an obligation to his mother, as a son has an obligation to their parents, and that includes the mother. For those things he talked about to honor, respect, gratitude, and assistance. The king owes that to his mother, and the king is a man and was born a man, and therefore had a mother and father, and therefore he owes his mother the same care that every man owes his parents, right? And therefore, does that mean that the king is under the authority of his mother? It is, 67. The subjection of a minor takes place in the father's temporary government, which terminates with the minority of the child, and the honor due from the child places in the parent a perpetual right to respect, reverence, support, and compliance to, more or less, as the father's case, cost and kindness in his education has been more or less. This ends not in minority, but holds in all parts of conditions of man life. The want of distinguishing these two powers, in other words, the power of the obligation, in other words, of obedience, in other words, respect, reverence, support, and compliance, versus that of command and subjugation, viz., that which the father have in the right of tuition during minority and the right of honor all his life, may perhaps have caused a great part of the mistakes about this matter. For to speak properly for them, the first of these is rather the privilege of children and duty of parents than any prerogative of paternal power. And again, this is, I think Locke here is a useful correction to feminists. This is a case, even though I have problems with Locke, and I think Locke is the Hobbesian. Locke also makes arguments really, you know, this what he's saying here about the question of parental power. He gives some support that it's not just men. It's not. This is true about both parents, right? But then he talks about the question of what does paternal power mean, and what is the obligations, what is the care of things. So I think this is great. I mean, this is why this thing is, in other words, to children, duty to parents, and the prerogative of paternal power. And the nourishment and education of their children is a charge and so incumbent upon parents for their children's good that nothing can absolve them of taking care of it. And although the power of commanding and chastening them go along with it, yet God has woven into the principles of human nature such a tenderness of their offspring that there is little fear that parents should use their power with too much rigor. The excess is seldom on the severe side, the strong bypass of nature drawing the other way. And therefore God Almighty, when he would express his gentle dealing with the Israelites, he tells them that though he chastened them as a man chastens a son, Deuteronomy 8, verse 5, i.e., with a tenderness and affection, and kept them under no severe discipline than what was absolutely best for them, and had been less had been less kindness to have slackened. In other words, if they've not done this, it would have been less kind of them, right? Not to punish them, would have been less kind. This is the power to which children are commanded obedience, that the pains and cares of their parents may not be increased or ill rewarded. Okay, so therefore, in other words, if the parents have taken care of you, they punish you, but they're not punishing you out of sadism. They're punishing you for your well-being. They're trying to educate you, and they're trying to correct you so that you are capable of reasoning. The argument here goes. So therefore, the example for the biblical case of God punishes the Israeli when they break the rules and they disobey, not because they disobey, but because their disobedience puts them in danger. Okay, and that by His punishment of them, it's not out of it's out of kindness that He punishes the parent. The punishment of a parent is done for the well-being of the child, and it would have been less kind to not punish. In other words, allowing the slackness, allowing the defect and the error to grow and to magnify would actually be less kind. Okay, which should, if God didn't care, didn't punish, and didn't try to correct, but rather just didn't care, that would be less kind, right? And this power which children are commanded obedience. In other words, this care, this idea of care, with parental care, pains and cares of their parents may not be increased or ill rewarded. In other words, they not be made the pains and the care of the parents, that the things they have to do because they have raised you, should not be made worse or ill rewarded. Right. 68. On the other side, honor and support all that which gratitude requires to return for the benefit received from, by, and from them is the indisputable duty of the child and the proper privilege of the parent. This is intended for the parent's advantage, as the other is for the child's. So therefore, there's idea of advantage. Parental care is the child's advantage. The obligation of respect is for the parent's advantage. These two things mutually support each other. In other words, when one is lost, the other one will be lost. Okay, and then the system breaks down. Right. This is the kind of rational argument that if you understood this in terms of interest, only of interest. Right. It's in children have an interest in the parents being through this. So therefore, children have an interest to make sure other parents, don't see the fact that, in other words, if all of a sudden every parent says, "Oh my God, the children aren't going to do anything for me. Why should I waste my time caring for them if they're not going to care for me? I just might as well enjoy myself and fuck them." In other words, the system breaks down, collapses. We can see this in a lot of a lot of millennials. Why the millennials are so, yes, sometimes they're overprotected and sometimes they're not overprotected, right? And so therefore, it indeed, for the parent's advantage and for the other child's through education and parent's duty, seem to have the most power. In other words, it is intended for the parent's advantage, and the other is for the child's. Though through education, the parent's duty seems to have most power, because the ignorance and infirmity of childhood stands in need of restraint and correction, while it is a visible exercise of rule in a kind of dominion. In other words, this education of the children, this care of children, is a kind of rule, and there is kind of the teacher has a kind of rule, the educator has a kind of rule and mastery in that sense, that looks as kind of a command, right? But it's limited in that sense, right? And that duty, which is comprehended in the word honor, requires less obedience, though the obligation be stronger on growth than younger children. For who can think the command, "Children, obey your parent," requires in a man that has children of his own the same submission to his father as it does in his yet young children to him, and that by this precept he was bound to obey all his father's commands. If out of a conceit of authority he should have the indiscretion to treat him still as a boy. In other words, he says here, parents obey the children, children obey your parents. Okay, well, yeah, does the father, the adult son, have this, is under that same obligation? Okay? Yes, it's clear in this case that, but when it's here, isn't there kind of something funny here? Isn't it when he makes kind of obey your parent requires a man that a child on his own the same submission to a father as it does that that by this precept he were bound to obey his father's commands, if at all, out of the conceit of authority. In other words, he should have the indiscretion to treat him still as a boy, right? The father. Um, let's go to the next part, 69. The first part of paternal power, or rather duty, which is education, belongs to the father. That terminates it at a certain season, when the business of education is over. It ceases of itself, and is also alienable before. For a man may put the tuition of his son into another hands, and he that has made his son the apprentice of another has discharged him during that time to the greater part of his obedience, both to himself and to his mother. But all the duty of honor, the other part, remains nevertheless entire to them. Nothing can cancel that. It is so inseparable from both that the father's authorities cannot dispose the mother's of this right, nor can any man discharge his son from honoring her that bore him. But both these are very far from a power to make laws, and enforcing them with penalties that may reach estate, liberty, life, and limb. In other words, he's saying there's limits to what these obligations are. These obligations to respect and honor don't have the ability to what in other words, have power to make laws and enforcing them with penalties that may reach estate, the property, liberty, limbs, and life. The power of commanding ends with nonage. It means that is, in other words, as underage, underageness, and though that after that, honor and respect, support and defense, and whatsoever gratitude can oblige a man to for the highest benefits he is naturally capable, be always due from a son to his parents. Yet all this puts no scepter into the father's hands, no sovereign power of commanding. He has no dominion over his son's properties or actions, or any right that his will should prescribe to his sons in all things. However, it may become his sons in many things. However, it may become his sons in many things. Not very inconvenient to him and his family to pay deference to it. In other words, it's not inconvenient to him and his family to pay deference to his father's obligation. In other words, has no power over them, no command, and that what is it? Are you right? That will should prescribe to his son in all things. Semicolon. However, it may become his son in many things. Not very inconvenient for him and his family to pay deference to him. In other words, paying deference is not means obligation. In other words, it may be in other words, it doesn't cost you anything to. He seems to be saying it doesn't cost you anything to pay homage, obedience, and deference to the father, right, or the parent in that sense. Section 70: a man may owe honor and respect to an ancient or wise man, defense to his child or friend, relief and support to the distressed, and gratitude to a benefactor to such a degree that all he has, all he can do, cannot sufficiently pay it. But all these give no authority, no right to anyone of making laws over him from whom they are owing. So therefore, he's saying this, that in other words, we may have Cicero and all those things make the argument that we have obligations to each other. In other words, social obligations. Man is born social and has obligations not only to his family, his peers, and other things like this all around. These obligations. And it is under these obligations that community consists, and political rule consists, right? And political authority has a jurisdiction over them, emerges from them, okay? This is what the Cicero argument in Dio Fecke seems to B. That man, in other words, this is the famous argument of Aristotle that the city is natural. The political community is a natural phenomenon emerging out of the household and emerging out of the man. The concept of procreation, the genetic argument, as well as the claim of those who know, those who have knowledge versus those who lack knowledge, right? The two parts of book one, chapter one, right? That these two bases are the basis of koinonia, community, and therefore that's the basis for the authority. The polis emerges. The polis is that it is that perfect community, that perfect embodiment of koinonia, which shapes the life and well-being of those who live on it. So therefore, the polis is by nature. Now Hobbes argues the city is not by nature. The political entity is social construct. Locke agrees with this. It's clear that Locke agrees that the city is not by nature. The political community, because in the state of nature there's no government. Okay, that he stinks between the time of nature, the state of nature, where there's no government, there's no one has authority, then to the point when the time of governments, right, the civil law, and those under the authority of government. Locke does separate these things. But at the same time, but therefore he needs thus he needs to make a clear distinction between what guarantees command, things that give you rights of authority over it, and the right of obligation and care. For the classics, these were connected. Locke differentiates. He says that everyone has an obligation to obey their parents and support their parents and give faith to their parents. But this does not give the parents control or command, perpetual command. Command seems to be based on consent in this sense. This is where we'll talk about this about political society, right? So therefore, you may have an obligation to this, like this, and he says, all you can do to pay it, but this does not give no authority, no right to you to anyone of making laws over him from whom they are owing. In other words, just because you're owed obedience, so this doesn't give this. And it is all plain that this is due not only to the bare title of father, but also because, as has been said, to owing to the mother too, but because these obligations to parents and to the degree of what is required to children may be varied by the different care and kindness, trouble and expense, which is often employed upon one child more than another. Okay, so therefore, this is in other words. So there's some children are going to have to require more care and expense than others, right? Some less, right? So it's not. So this care and obligation that children have for their parents, respect in this thing, doesn't need to command or authority over them. Okay. But then again, this idea of the wise man, the old. See, remember the argument in Aristotle was also about, and not Plato too, but the one who knows. The one who knows have a right to command authority. That's the classic argument. In other words, the argument of the arts is the one who knows, the one who has wisdom, the one who has knowledge or techne or skill, commands and has the right to rule over the one who lacks knowledge, right? This is more Aristotle's argument about in book one, right? The foresighted versus the unforesighted, right? Now, Locke seems to agree with that, but then seems to argue that ideally all men have reason. Okay, so therefore, and as long as all men have reason, no man can equally rule over another. Okay, Aristotle would not disagree with that, but Aristotle would say, "But wait a minute, every man's not equal in capacity to reason." More, in fact, this if all men were capable, equal in other words, equally having enough reason to make judgment, then there'd be no need for government. This is that famous "they men are angels" that we know that Madison's right. If men were capable of reasoning to know what their interests were and all those things were, then perhaps there would be no need for government authority in that sense. That's one argument, right? Um, the reason is that because people are in ignorance, that not everyone is equally capable of knowing what is in their interests and knowing in their things. There is this inequality regarding reason, and this inequality regarding reason leads to problems that therefore justifies the rule of the wise over the ignorant, right? That's the mastery argument. That's the argument for mastery. Aristotle says that's problematic, and he himself says, politically speaking, the argument from excellence is more problematic because it's not clear who is simply wise and who is best. It's no longer at one level, it's not obvious to everyone that, in other words, it only works when it's obvious that I'm the master, I'm the better one, I'm the wisest one, and everyone would normally submit in their own interest. But because it's not obvious that they're the better one or the more capable, and because it's not clear, the people will not submit to the authority of the claim. Right? That's that argument in Book 3 of the Politics. Here, Locke. This is kind of the same thing in Locke in that sense. Locke seems here to kind of offer you a kind of middle ground here, saying that listen, um, what is it? It's more like that the obedience that we owe to the children is one thing. That even the obedience we owe to the wise, this is not sufficiently to justify command. One, yes, you have an obligation to your parents, and yes, the wise should have obligation to listen to the one more intelligent of you. But that does not give the one who's more intelligent of you the command and has authority over what you can and cannot do. So therefore, there is, in other words, that political command or things like that. In other words, the political command or the ability to make laws that limit your authority and limit your freedom can only come from consent. This will be the kind of rationale in the sense. Um, right? Um, so let's do 71. This shew the reason how it comes to pass that parents and societies, where they themselves are subject, retain a power over their children and have as much right to their subjection as those who are in the state of nature, which could not possibly be if all political power were only paternal, that in truth they were one and the same thing. For then all paternal power being in the prince, the subject would naturally have none of it. But these two powers, the political and the paternal, are so perfectly distinct and separate, are built upon so different foundations, and and different and given to so different ends, that every subject that is a father has as much paternal power over his children as a prince has over his, and every prince that has parents owes to them as much fealty, duty, and obedience as the meanest of his subjects do to theirs, and can therefore contain not any part or degree of the kind of dominion which a prince or magistrate has over his subject. Again, this is a brilliant kind of arguing against, and actually, this is there's nothing here that is in disagreement with Aristotle here. I think Aristotle would perfectly agree with this argument that political power and paternal power are two different things. So Locke and Aristotle are in agreement on this point. I think this is the point, and this is what leads to many people to think of Locke-Aristotle. Okay, Locke-Aristotle, that's the word that some of us created in the 1990s, of those who want to turn that merge Aristotle and Locke. Yes, there's places where Locke seems to be repeating an agreement with Aristotle, but at others he's completely like Hobbes, for Hobbes he's the anti-Aristotle. Right? Hobbes is the anti-Aristotle. Locke embraces sometimes Aristotle's language and Aristotle's arguments as he uses Hooker, and Hooker is very much Christian Aristotelian, but his use of Hooker is opportunistic, and I think his use of Aristotle here is opportunistic in that sense. Now let's turn to section 72. Though the obligation of the parent to bring up their children and obligations on children to honor their parents contain all the power of, on the one hand, and submission on the other, which are proper to this relation, yet there is another power ordinary in the father, whereby he has ties to the obligation whereby he has a tie on the obligation of his children, which, though be it common to him with other men, which occasions of showing it, almost certainly happening to fathers in their private families, and the instance of it elsewhere being rare, and taken less notice of it. Of it's taken of it passes it passes in the world for a part of parental jurisdiction, and this is the power men generally have to bestow their estates on those whom please them best, the possession of the father being the exception, and the inheritance of the children ordinary in certain proportions, according to the laws and customs of each country. Yet it is commonly in the father's power to bestow it with a more sparing or liberal hand, according as the behavior of this or that child has comported with his will and his humor. So there's the idea that parents are able to, fathers, particularly in their wills of handing their estates to their children, can often, generally they should, the idea of some should inherit something, but the idea that the amount they give to each child could vary in that degree. Now, some societies, like in Europe, continental Europe, has equal proportion. All there's no, in other words, a parent cannot disinherit a child, but Locke and English law they can, and in fact, English law goes even further up until the modern period, until recent time, until the 20th century. The idea that everything goes all the fathers and but I mean, not all, but the idea of the estate, the main estate of a father, if you own an estate, if you own an entail or title, it goes to the first son, primogenitor, right? Uh, and that if there is no son to inherit, the father can leave money or capital that is not tied to the estate, that does not come from the estate, to the daughters and widow, but he cannot give the estate and the estate anything that generates from the title or land or estate to the wife, the daughters. Okay, in that sense, it goes to his first son, his son, his heir, his son heir. And if he doesn't have a son heir, the nearest heir inherited. Again, that's primogeniture. His nearest heir surviving heir will inherit the land and the estate. And if there's no estate, then the king inherits. If there's none of them, then the king inherits that estate in that sense, in English law. 73. This is no small tie on the obedience of children, their being always annexed to the enjoyment of land, a submission to the government of the country, of which that land is part. It has been commonly supposed that a father could oblige his posterity to that government, of which he himself was a subject, and that his compact held them, whereby it being only a necessary condition annexed to the land, and the inheritance of the estate under which that govern that the estate which is under that government reaches only to those who take, in other words, those who will take it on that condition, and so is the natural tie or engagement, but a voluntary submission for every man's children being by nature free as himself, or any of his ancestors ever were, may, while they are in that freedom, choose what society they may join themselves to, what commonwealth they will put themselves under. So this is even more. He goes harder. In other words, this idea that the idea is once that this idea that the political obligation you are is tied to the fact that you are by your parents' birth and the right of it. But he says that, well, he ties that to land, the land where the land is under. He ties this to the physical possession of land. But is citizenship really tied to the father's property in that sense? In that sense, or is there an obligation? In other words, is there obligation just by being born in this place and subject to the rules of this place? And there's no choice in this matter. The Locke gives it a much more voluntaristic approach here, right? They voluntarily submit to it. They accept the land. If they accept the land, and therefore they have to be governed by it. That's a voluntary. They can refuse the land. They can decide, I don't want to be subject to that law, so I'm not going to accept the property of my father. I will choose instead to go be a citizen over here. Okay, that's okay. But if they will enjoy the inheritance of their ancestors, they must take it on the same terms their ancestors did. That's even more. So, what is the inheritance? Is the inheritance merely the property? Maybe it is the education and things like that. But maybe even the inheritance may be the fact that you were educated, you were given education, you were given care. Okay, that only requires you an obligation. Remember that's the funny thing. That care and that things only honor, respect, and that, not command. But civil ties, citizenship, and subjecthood goes beyond that. It's not only respect; it's also command, right? Political authority in a sense. So, taking answer and to subject all the condition annexed to in such possession. By this power, indeed, fathers oblige their children to obedience to themselves, even when they are past minority, and most commonly to subject them to this or that political power. But neither of these by any particular right of fatherhood. In other words, there's not a right of fatherhood, right? But by the reward they have in their hands to enforce and the recompense such a compliance, and is no more power than what a Frenchman has over an Englishman, who, by hopes of an estate he will leave him, will certainly have a strong tie on his obedience. And if, when it is left him, he will enjoy it, he must certainly take it upon conditions annexed to the possession of the land in that country where it lives, whether it is France or England. To conclude, then, though the father's powers of commanding extends no farther than the minority of his children, and to the degree only fit for the discipline and governance of that age, and though that honor and respect and all that which the Latins called piety, faithfulness, right, which they indisputably owe to their parents all their lifetimes, and in all estates, which all that supports and defend is due to them, gives the father no power of governing, i.e., making laws and enacting penalties over the children. Though by all this he has no dominion over the property or actions of his son. Yet it is obvious to conceive how easy it was in the first ages of the world and in all places where the thinnest of peoples give families leave to separate into unpossessed quarters, and they have room to remove or plant themselves in yet vacant habitations, for the father of the family to become prince of it. He has been a ruler from the beginning of the infancy of his children. And since without some government it would be hard for them to live together, it was likely as it should, by the express or tacit consent of the children, when they were grown up, to be in the father, where it seemed without any change barely to continue. Um, and indeed, nothing was more required of it to it than permitting the father to exercise alone in the family that executive power of the law of nature, which every man, which every free man naturally hath, and by that permission, reassigning up to him a monarchical power, whilst they remained in it. In other words, that this early state of condition. This is talking about tribal society, right? This is, what he's saying here is that in hunter-gatherer and an early society where there was lots of mobility, people set up the shop, it was simply just easier to let the father rules, and this just became, they agreed to it, and that therefore this became custom and habit, the structure of this, and this was all consented to, by the way, because it was just the best way to do it. It's not that it was that fathers automatically had this right. It was simply this was the easiest way that they could stay together and work together, right? This is what Locke is saying, that this was something that they agreed to, it's consented to in that sense. But that this was not by any paternal right, but only by the consent of his children, is evident from hence that nobody doubts. But if a stranger who chance or business has brought to his family, there be killed by any of his children, or committed any other fact that he might condemn and put to death, or otherwise have punished him, as well as any of his children, which it is impossible he should do by virtue of paternal authority over one who was not his child, but a virtue of that executive power of the law of nature, which as a man he had a right to, and he alone could punish him in the family, where in the respect of his children had laid by the exercise of such power to give way to the dignity and authority they were willing should remaining in him, above the rest of the family. So therefore, this is like the argument of why kings emerged, and why the king father and kingly power emerged in tribal societies. In this sense, it is no improbable opinion, therefore, which the arch philosopher was of, that the chief person in every household was always, as it were, a king. So when okay, this is I think Aristotle he's referring to here. So when numbers of households joined themselves in civil society together, kings were in fact the first governors amongst them, which is also, as it seems, the reason why the name of fathers continued still to them, who of fathers were made rulers, as also in the ancient customs of governors to do with the Malkides, and became kings to the extent the office of priest, which fathers did at first grow perhaps by the same occasion. Howbeit, this was not only kind of regiment. This is not the only kind of regiment that had been received in the world. The inconvenience of one kind have caused sundry of others to be devised. So, in a word, all public regiments, of what kind soever, seemeth evident to have arisen from the deliberative advice, consultation, and composition between men judging it convenient and behoove, there being no impossibility in nature, consist by itself, but man might have lived without any public agreement. Now, this is Hooker, Physiological Polity, Book 1, Chapter 10. So that, in other words, they could have lived without an agreement. In other words, they could have. That's unlikely in that sense, right? It's inconceivable that one can cause sundry others to be devised, all these different structures, right? All different varieties. A judging that's convenient behove, there being no impossibility in nature considered by itself, but that man might have lived without any public anarchy. This is the idea of that could be without any public regimen, a public order, a public structure. Could man live without that? Section 75. Thus, it is easy and almost natural for children, by a tacit and scarce avoidable consent, to make way for the father's authority and government. In other words, they do consent by tacit consent. They had been accustomed in their childhood to follow his direction and refer their little differences to him. And when they were men, who fitter to rule them? Their little properties, unless covetousness seldom affords greater controversies, and when any should rise, where could they have a fitter umpire than he, who by whose care they had every one been sustained and brought up, and who had a tremendous has a tenderness for them all. It is no wonder that they made no distinction betwixt minority and full age, nor looked after 1 and 20, or any other age that might make them free of disposers of themselves and fortunes, make this their free disposers of themselves and fortune, when they could have no desire to be out of their parentage, pupilage. The government they had been under during it continued still to be more their protection than restraint, and they could nowhere find a greater security to their peace, liberties, and fortune than the rule of the father. So therefore, he's making the argument: wow, this 74 and 75 seems to be his explanation of how monarchy and tribal government emerges. And it too is by consent, both active consent and passive consent, tacit consent. Thus, the natural fathers of families, by the insensible change, became the politic monarchs of them too. And as they chanced to live long and leave able and worthy heirs for several successions or otherwise, they laid the foundations of hereditary and active kingdoms under several constitutions and manners, according as chance, contrivance, and occasion happens to mold them. But if princes have their titles in their father's right, and it be sufficient proof of the natural right of fathers to political authority, because they commonly were those whose hands we find de facto the exercise of government. I say, if this argument be good, it will surely prove that all princes, nay, princes only, ought to be priests, since it is certain that in the beginning fathers of the family was the priest, as that he was the ruler in his own household. That's a very, in other words, if this argument about political rule, then he ought to be priest as well. Because really, that the early tribes, that the priests and the fathers, and the priests and the rulers are one. And by doing this puts he kind of thrusts the church and the king into opposition to each other. Well, here we end this right there. We end Paternal Power. This has been a long one. I apologize. If you have any questions, please put it below. I respond it when I see it. Like it if you liked it. If you don't like it, say why you didn't like it. What's wrong, why it's wrong, or share it, spread it, send it to others if you liked it. Share it and subscribe to get more. Encourage others who you think they might like it. If you've seen this and want to see what came before it, you can see it. Subscribe. If you want to help support, you can follow me on social media below. If you want to help me continue doing these kind of things, you can always, through Subscribestar or through Patreon, which I don't really check that much doing this. Or you go buy my book through Lulu, or Lulu is better than I get more money that way. But if you order it through Amazon, I'll still make some money from it. So my book is a notebook for Aristotle's Politics, which is a kind of a guide about reading the politics, which someday after this I might do. Okay, the politics. So I might decide to do the thing as well. Well, that's it. Have a good day, and next time we meet, we'll do Chapter 7 of Political or Civil Society. Okay? Take care. Bye-bye.